It's interesting that because I for some reason I thought you might have still actually been in Japan. I just sort of had a cursory glance, and then Simon actually said, "Oh, it looks like Fernando's in London."
No, much to my chagrin, I'm in London. It would have. This sounds really weird, but it would have been nice to go through this in Japan with my house, with my music studio and my sort of workshop space and everything. But I moved to London at the end of 2019 with a plan we were going to renovate this house that we've got here, and I was going to get a studio space somewhere in the neighbourhood. And then pandemic happened. So all my stuff is in storage, basically.
But we're neighbours, Fernando. I'm also in London. We must be just down the road from each other.
Yeah, can you hear that ambulance going past?
Yeah, that's the one I can.
Yeah, so it's just been odd. I arrived here and didn't really have time to get to know anybody or make any connections or friends. And I was, flew back from seeing my parents in Australia in time to think, why hasn't the country locked down yet? And sort of cancelled everything. And then 2 weeks later we had lockdown, and I've sort of been here ever since.
So are you saying this is your first time living in the UK, or?
No, I lived in the UK about 20 years ago.
So a while ago, yeah.
In a previous life as an academic. And I left the UK in 2001, one of those two, to go live in India. And then from India, I went to Hong Kong and Singapore, and we met in Japan.
Wow. Yeah, no, I was actually thinking about that today, just the first time you and I met, when I believe it might have been at Touchy Studios, and we're just one of the kind of the creative meetups, Tokyo creative meetups.
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely remember at that time being inspired by your story and just kind of your approach to things. And, in a roundabout way, kind of reconnecting and sort of following some of the ideas that you were talking about then around technology and creativity and things, which is quite inspiring for me then, and I didn't really fully understand it. And now coming back to it, how important it is, and kind of evergreen in a way. So, yeah, Japan, we were there. How long were you in Japan for?
6 years.
Wow. And you've still got a place there, right? A studio and...
Yeah, so I lived in Tokyo. I don't have that place anymore, but while I was there, I built a cabin in the woods, basically. So I've got a place in the mountains. That again, it was funny when we were building it, because I used to joke with my daughter that, when the zombie apocalypse comes, we can all go and hide out here and raise chickens and, build a little pond and have salmon or something. But we weren't able to get back there. But I've got a little place up in the mountains, which was really built as a retreat and also as a place to do photography and writing.
Yeah, is it in the countryside, I guess?
Yeah, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's middle of nowhere, Nagano. Like Japan, it's actually pretty convenient to get to by a train and a bus, but it's just looking at a river and a mountain, and that's about it.
It's really interesting, that difference between, say, the city, Tokyo, certainly, and the countryside. There's this huge divide, and I always think back and wonder, I should have spent more time in the countryside, because I really enjoyed that. One of my favorite places was Shizuoka, and spending time in the old ryokans and kind of following in the footsteps of the old writers and whatnot. And Nagano is nice as well, and just sort of getting away from the city. And I feel, Simon, potentially you might agree with this, but Tokyo is quite a big place, and it has sort of a different mode of operation to the countryside.
And it really sort of negatively affects you quite easily. Whereas spending time in the countryside, you just feel so refreshed. But was there a reason you chose Nagano?
I like mountains. I like skiing. I like the countryside. I had the opportunity to do a bit of hiking on the old like Hokkaido Way and the Kiso Road, and just that bend of when you go through Gifu up into the snow country and then back out of the snow country towards Karuizawa. I just think that's all spectacular.
It's fantastic, yeah.
And I thought if I want to have a place that I can use as an excuse to go 1 hour in any direction and have something amazing to explore, that looked like a pretty good place to be.
Yeah, I mean, Niigata for me is one of the places that's really close to my heart. I spent a little bit of time just sort of traveling through Kashiwazaki and that sort of area, and it really is snow country. And there's that famous line from Kawabata Yasunari, the Kokyo no Nagai Tonaru, I entered through the long tunnel and then I arrived in snow country. And I always remember being enchanted by just the little country trains and the dinky stations and just sort of how slow and quiet everything was, and spending just a little bit of time out there and just you pass through those tunnels and you arrive and there's something different in the air,
Yeah.
It really is. It is quite beautiful. And I think, looking at, I was in Tokyo for 5 years and, it is concrete, and in a way, the concrete are their own mountains. They're sort of this built environment. But spending time in the countryside, it is important. And now you're in London, so you're sort of back in the city. And do you have a getaway in the UK at all that you can sort of go to, or?
No, I mean I live close to a large park, which sounds like a bit of a cop out, but actually, during the pandemic and during the lockdowns and everything else, being able to almost cross the road and be in a big park was actually quite a gift. And I think it helped keep me sane. I can walk for an hour and a half in there comfortably without sort of doubling over myself.
Yeah.
And that's enough time, just around some trees and some birds and with people further away from you. You almost start to feel like you're calming down.
It's that sort of subconscious work, right? Where you perform an action that is going to enable you to get into a more relaxed state, and it is easy in this modern world to just let the busyness of everything kind of overwhelm you. And I mean, to be honest, for myself lately, I would say I'm probably at a low point in my life, just with everything going on. And it's important, to come back to that and think, well, what are the things that you can do to come back and kind of ground yourself and kind of, reset things a little bit, and nature and going out for walks. So I think we've talked a little bit about this before, Simon, haven't we? Just getting out of the house and kind of leaving things behind in that space that you're in, that mental space, and then going out and doing something different.
It sounds like, Fernando, you had quite a positive experience during lockdown, going out to your local park and sort of de-stressing, as you said. Was there anything else positive that came out of the lockdown for you?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to describe it as a positive experience all around. I think there was plenty that was dark and hard about the whole thing, and being separated from family and things like that has been really difficult. And it massively interrupted my plans for what I thought I would be doing with 2020, which we can talk about later maybe. But I think the big positive for me was that early on I thought, I kind of entered this mode where I thought this is going to go on for a long time. I think a lot of people were like, well, it'll be over by the summer and, it'll be an inconvenience for a few weeks. And I thought, no, this is actually probably this could go on for 3 or 4 years. So what can I do here? And I looked at my artistic practice and I thought, well, I have a fantastic studio full of music gear that is in storage, and that's not going to come out anytime soon. And my photography has usually been built around travel and nature and landscapes, and I can't really do that either, but I can write. So I'm going to double down on writing. And I was planning to write a book during 2020, but the nature of that book wasn't going to work. So I really focused on writing for my blog, writing about creativity, writing about the influence of technology on our well-being. And I've had it's coming out, it feels like it's approaching 2 years worth of really solid writing. And that's been a good time of exploration of, I was going to use the word research, but that's a bit of a dodgy word to use at the moment in the pandemic. But definitely a lot of like thinking, reflection, I guess self-correction around some of my beliefs. And I think just focusing on the thing that I could do in this moment, in this space, I think that proved to be a decision that kept paying off positively.
That's incredible to hear.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm interested. You mentioned the correction of your beliefs. Is that something in terms of, say, a personal belief, or just a general sort of something that you hold as sort of you once held as a fact, or is that something you could tell us a little bit more about?
I think I generally tend to err on the side of being pretty optimistic about human nature. And I think during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of really good human behaviour, but we've also seen a lot of stuff that I've been very surprised by people's unwillingness to cooperate at times. I've been very surprised by sort of a general air of, I guess, judgmentalism, to use a bit of a cliche, about people and about people's situations. I've been very surprised by the lack of curiosity about how people are experiencing this in other parts of the world. It was infuriating here in the UK to watch the news sort of presenting the pandemic or how to respond to the pandemic a certain way. And then you'd be reading news from other parts of the world and going, well, they've actually started doing this thing and it seems to work. And it's maybe less restrictive than what we're doing, but it's a slight change. Why can't we learn from them? And it felt like I would read the news from Australia and it was, again, very insular. And I think I had to kind of think about, well, what's going on here in terms of how people experience uncertainty, or how they process fear, or how they process information, or whether journalism is quite working now the way I think it used to work, or the way I assumed that it worked. So a lot of that sort of stuff. And it's been, I think there's a lot of things happening at the moment that are, that have kind of accelerated as a result of the pandemic, but they're trends we've been seeing for a while.
Sorry, what sort of trends would you think those are?
I think, I think we've been in a sort of long-term drift towards surveillance capitalism. And I think that's kind of accelerated now. And I don't necessarily just mean that in terms of like government seeking control in lockdown or things like that. There's part of that, but I think also, like I got this thing in the mail that was called a participation survey, and it was from the government, and it was like a census, but it wasn't a census. And it kind of looked like I had to do it, but it never said like it was compulsory, but I had to participate, sort of thing. And it was asking me a whole bunch of questions about, do I use parks very often? Do I use local libraries? Do I have learning experiences in the community? All these kinds of things, which are issues that, you know, governments have been, there's been a progressive sort of lowering of funding for things like public libraries for a long time. And this whole idea of whether we even need public libraries anymore because everything is digital, right? And so it's asking me all those kind of questions, but it's also asking me all these questions about how I use social media, what kind of content I use on social media, how do I share, how do I feel about the things that I share? Do I research the stuff that I share before I share it? And I think that's a whole lot of really detailed information that the government is going to have connected to my address, right? It's not really randomised, it's connected to my address. And the kicker is that the survey isn't been run by the Office of National Statistics or something like that. It's been run by the Kantar Group, which is a big like PR, corporate relations entity on behalf of the government. So I think it's things like that that feel like they've accelerated during this time.
Yeah, no, it is interesting you mentioned that. I feel, very similar. Just yesterday, we've got an email, regarding some of these vaccine certificates that are coming to New Zealand, and just sort of some of the privacy and data implications for what that opens up, and basically, showing, at anyone's request, your medical history, and sort of the path that leads down. And one of the concerns that I've had for a while now is that people are forgetting history, and where, once something like that becomes mainstream and it's used, then the next time it needs to be used, and then the time after that is when you really need to be worried, and what that looks like. And there seems to be this kind of furore that will do anything to avoid another lockdown, but at what expense? And when government and big tech come together to build these tools, in the old days it was all paper, and there was this sort of different parts of the government didn't talk to each other, and so there was this freedom in some respects. But now, when it's all centralized, and I remember there was a thing actually from Australia a while back, the robo debt. I don't know if that was something you're aware of.
Yeah, I don't really follow the Australian news that much, but that was a pretty bad example of tech going wrong.
What was that?
It was a system to basically try to claw back welfare payments from people, an automated system, and it ended up just targeting, really disproportionately targeting disadvantaged people, but also just not working properly.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges was that it was bringing in information from different sources and different parts of the government, which meant there were sort of these black holes that, and it was automated. So it was just sending out bills that, you need to pay this, or it might have even been just taking the money out of people's accounts. I can't quite remember, but it was quite dystopian.
Yeah, and it's hard to stand up to stuff like that when you get something that looks official. I mean, it's like this thing. I kept looking at this participation survey to try and figure out whether it was compulsory. And, I went to do it and I didn't want to finish it. And then we got a paper copy in the mail saying it looks like not everybody, your residents, completed the participation survey. Yeah. And I'm like, but is it compulsory? Like,
do you think there's been a change in language? I mean, the reason I mention that is one thing I've noticed is the way governments talk about themselves. And so, obviously we've got this pandemic and lockdowns and all sorts. And even just regarding these vaccine certificates, these papers that you need to be shown on demand, the way the language is used on the website to describe it, there's no subject. It's not you or I. It just papers, the vaccine certificate needs to be shown. But the specific legality, when you see something on a government website, you think, well, this must be because it's the law. But they can say whatever they want. Here's your compulsory participation survey, but under what legal framework am I obliged to fill that out is not clear. And so there's this almost pseudo-legal layer of web text that kind of explains what you need to do, but it's not actually the law.
Yeah, the digital copy that holds us from reality. Yeah. I think, I think this is part of a sort of a longer trend. You look at the way, like, what is it the British Rail calls passengers now? You're not a passenger, you're a client.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, there's something when you're on a train, you're not a passenger anymore. You're a client. You're a customer of the service, right? And I think this kind of language has been shifting for some time. I think you're definitely right that governments are changing the way they speak about themselves and the way they speak about us. But I think also the other thing is it's just kind of hard sometimes to find like good explaining reporting or information about things. So like with things, because I mean, I'm generally on the side of things like being able to demonstrate that you've been vaccinated in order to travel, in order to access a whole bunch of things. I think we need to do that. And I think there's been, I wasn't born in Australia. I was born in Chile. So immigrating to Australia, we had to show our vaccination papers in order to immigrate. And traveling around the world, I've had to show vaccination papers in various countries that I've traveled to as well. So I don't see that as problematic. But I feel like the sort of the detailed nuance of the conversation, it's often hard to find where can I tune in to kind of hear the detailed nuance of the conversation and the technical language. And like you said, the legality of what's going on. It's not always easy. I think we have an increasingly coarse environment when it comes to communication and news, and sort of the blurring of opinion from explanation, if you want to use that kind of language.
Where do you get your news from, Fernando?
From a multitude of places. So, I do rely pretty heavily on the sort of classic East Coast US stuff. I read the Washington Post, I read the New York Times, I read The Atlantic, which I think has had some of the best pandemic reporting, sort of straight up long form essays, talking to epidemiologists and people like that. They've been ahead of a bunch of ways that the pandemic has shifted over the last year and a half. The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books. And then what I tend to like to do as well, as much as I can, is go on Twitter, find editors who work at newspapers that I quite like or that I know of, and look at the lists that they have, their sort of like topic specialization lists. So, for example, The Atlantic's politics editor, in the run-up to the US election, he had a list that was called People Who Actually Know Something. And it was just local journalists in states. So it wasn't really anybody who was covering the national election race. It was like somebody who does a lot of reporting about redistricting in Georgia, for example, or, somebody in Michigan who tends to cover a lot of local politics in Michigan. And it was crazy because on the night of the election, you could turn CNN on and they're sort of guessing whatever else. And then these people are all just spitting the latest numbers from the place that they're in, and explaining, well, this district hasn't come in yet. And in this year it went this way and in this year it went this way. And so there's those kind of tools. I think if you're crazy about knowing what's going on and willing to invest a lot of time in doing it, you can sort of build up a bit of an information base. But even that's just the slice I've made. I'm not sure that's always right.
You had a really nice tweet recently. I went through your Twitter, and you said that one really good way to use Twitter is to make a list of people who really inspire you and post really original content. And then for a whole week, you recommended only read that list on Twitter. I really enjoyed that. That was such a nice idea.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Twitter is really quite customizable, and I think sometimes people feel like you just have to go in there and just it happens to you, and you have no control over it. Lists are great because you can just simply tune into certain kinds of people. You can tune into people without necessarily following them. So this list, for example, I saved the one that I mentioned, but, it's just there if I'm ever curious. I can go in and dive into something like that. The one that you mentioned, I think that's really important, because I think like in life, the people you surround yourself with is, hugely important, right?
Yeah, we are the sum of the 5 people that we spend most time with, right?
Yeah, I think Jim Rohn got that completely right. Twyla Tharp said that the best predictor of who you'll become is the books you read and the people you meet.
Yeah.
And I guess along those lines, something that I've definitely noticed for myself is that a lot of the negativity and the fear that exists in the mainstream media and also in social media, it has this profound effect on me. It's just sort of, it can hit you, and you almost need to take on a media diet as you go through the journey of creativity, because really that's what we're really interested, or I'm really interested in, is how in this uncertain time, when no one really knows what's going on, impossible to really fully encapsulate what is every single thing that's happening in the world, how can we as creative practitioners follow our passion and maintain that passion and not let this external thing blow the flame out? Because it seems like it's somewhere else, and if you just turn it off, you can focus on what's important. How do you find you manage the media diet for yourself?
I think you've got to really think about how much you allow it to be random. And I think, I used to love, I used to love when I was in Tokyo, I would, like, you'd log into like something like Twitter, for example, and see a bunch of people complaining about how horrible the world is. And then go outside and go for a walk and see kids playing in the local park, and see grandparents supervising them, and see people shopping, and see neighbours chatting. So I think having an attention to your local environment and coming back to your local environment, like I've talked about the park, for example, or the garden where you live, or your own home, or your own practice. And I think being in that space, I think it's very easy to just constantly be on this feed, right? And that's mediating reality for you. And your primary reality is here where you are. I mean, like I said about the writing, for example, in the last year and a half, that's the thing I could do in that space. And in this space, I've got, I have real control about what I can do in this space. Some politician from another country isn't in this room with me right now.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention that, because I really respond well to that. And I remember back also to my time in Tokyo, and there was a lot of stuff happening. We had missile launches from North Korea, we had everything,
Yeah.
But it was, back then everything that was happening in say New Zealand seemed so far away, and now in New Zealand, what's happening over there that seems a bit further away, and what's happening here seems a lot more close, but it's still it's out there. They're not in here. And today I thought, go out. I went for a walk. It was a bit of a miserable Wellington spring day, but overcast and windy. But I went out, got out of the house, went for a bit of a walk over the hill, and did a bit of writing in a cafe and whatnot. And it was really just great to get out and see people. And in a way, that feeling when you're writing and you're kind of imagining, for fiction, you're imagining and kind of world building in your mind. In a way, kind of hooking onto this media feed, it's kind of hijacking that transformative, imaginative aspect of your mind, and it's using it against you. And so you're kind of creating these demons in your mind that are not really there. You're letting the anxiety and the negativity get you, but it's really, you just can just turn it off and repurpose it.
Yeah, I think there's I don't want to sound like there aren't a lot of bad things in the world that we should be concerned about. But I think part of what our digital devices do is they make it very easy to blur the edges around our activities and to turn everything into a kind of brown doom scrolling experience. So I feel like for example, for email for me, I don't do email every day. And I try really hard not to do email every day. And when I do email, and then I'm finished. Like, it has a certain amount of time. Because if you think about domestic chores, I mean, if you spent all day washing dishes, like one of your friends would pull you over and go, hang on, is something going on here? You can stop washing the dishes after a while. And it's the same with news. I think Twitter is a fantastic platform, but it's a terrible way to consume news. It's really good in an event. So when there's an earthquake in Japan, for example, it's great. You can, quickly find out where was the earthquake, what did people experience, was it worse than what I had, but then you're gone again. But staying on there for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, however long, just scrolling through news, you'll eventually hook onto something horrible to obsess about.
It's more likely to float to the top. The sort of the amount of negative stuff out there is vastly outweighs the good in terms of the way the media show it, and
and the algorithm pushes the negativity to the top a couple of times. I mean, one of the things we saw with the Facebook whistleblower recently was the way the algorithm weighted engagement in favor of people being angry about stuff. So, I think it's not serving our interests. So I think if we're interested in safeguarding our creativity, then we actually have to safeguard, how much news do you want, consume that much, and then go and do something else.
Do you think there's been a fragmentation of people's attention spans as well with this kind of tidbit of media consumption?
I wonder about that. I mean, there was an interesting, last week I heard a really interesting stat from it was a conference speaker, and they were from the e-payments and global e-commerce and payments practice of Accenture. And they were saying that in China, 30% of people on social media identify themselves as creators. 50% identify themselves as curators, and 20% identify themselves as just passive consumers. Whereas in the US, 1% identify themselves as creators, 9% identify themselves as curators, and 90% identify themselves as passive consumers.
Wow.
Now, we all know that if you go to a social media platform as a creator, you've already had to spend a bit of time doing something, right? So actually your attention's not necessarily totally fragmented by the experience, because you've had to focus on making something first. But if 90% of people are passive consumers, then sure, that does look an awful lot like it's just, a hyperactive hive mind going on online to be distracted, right? And I think maybe there's something in that about how we could rethink some of these kind of platforms and the way we talk about them. Because if you're, in order to create, you have to be concentrating.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I find really interesting, I'm working on a novel myself and doing a lot of different things. And, today it's, 3 hours sitting in the corner of a convenience store with an eat-in section where I can just sit there writing, and, there's a few little distractions here and there. But for me to engage in the work, to really go into this world that I'm building in my mind and trying to write about, it takes this kind of active focus and to get into that world. And it only takes a little thing to take you out of it. And this kind of meditative state, which I remember someone mentioned that Tarkovsky's films trying to induce this kind of sort of somewhere between almost drifting off to sleep and being conscious. And you kind of, that's the space where the creativity kind of emerges. It's not this very logical, clinical mindset which you might have when you're writing an email and you're kind of trying to craft the language. It's more like this kind of dreamlike state. I don't know, maybe it's like a flow state or something like that. And it's almost a mythical thing. And if you're tweeting about something as you're doing it, or you're trying to hustle your project as you're trying to do it, it almost seems like you're doing both things wrong. Yeah.
Cody, do you have a sort of way to get into your meditative state of working, of writing? Like, do you have, I guess, like a ritual or something that gets you ready for the creative process?
I'm still trying to formalize that. I'll tell you when I find out. But I guess one of the big things for me, definitely this year, has been just this realization that time is short. Life is short. Things need to be done. I don't know, Fernando. What about yourself when you're creating? I mean, what does your engagement with your kind of creative side look like?
I think the thing that's really important for me is not opening up that opportunity is knowing that I'm not going to be interrupted. It's interesting in terms of my writing practice, for example, I feel I write most mornings. It averages out about 6 times a week. And it's evolved. I wrote a piece on my blog about sort of how the writing practice evolved over the years in connection with being a parent and a whole bunch of things. It was a moment in the day that I had was early in the morning to write. But I am pretty much running from my bed to my iPad in the morning. And I'm trying as much as I can to not interact with anybody or anything. So if I could get away with not having breakfast and writing, I would. But I flag pretty quickly. So I wake up, I put a jinbei on, I go to the kitchen, I make myself a basic breakfast. It's pretty much the same every day. Some muesli, some yogurt, some fruit, some kind of cold meats, and I pour myself a big glass of water and I sit down and I start writing. And there's nothing really in my head at that point. I've usually set up my workspace. I write in Scrivener, so I know where I'm picking up from. I've usually got a few different things that I'm writing at the same time, but I've pushed one to the top the day before, and it's like, this is probably where you should start, and I usually start there, and I just write for about an hour and a half.
Do you listen to music at all?
I have a playlist of instrumental music. It's some jazz, some soundtrack music, some folk stuff, some Indian classical music, and that's on shuffle, and that list hasn't changed for about 10 years.
Oh, that's nice.
It's about 100 tracks, and it's like nothing is slower than about 70, 80 BPM. Nothing is faster than about 130, but it is all instrumental.
Yeah, instrumental is important. I definitely can relate to that. I've got I find I actually have pieces that go with different projects that I'm writing. So with my novel, it's 2 or 3 3-hour ambient music mixes, very slow, morphing, just sound, just harmonies pretty much. And those have been getting me through over the last 2 years. And they're quite a nice chunk of time because it's 2 to 3 hour pieces. And when that finishes, then I've kind of finished writing, I guess, that session. And Scrivener, I can attest to that as well. It's what I write with, and it's a very powerful system, but it's also very dynamic. Like, I feel like I can just jump in there, and it feels like a workbench. Like, I can move things around. It's quite non-linear if you want it to be. You can do notes.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very powerful. And the early morning thing, I'm interested that you mentioned that because it must take a lot of discipline when you've got a family and children and whatnot to kind of find the time and make the time to get,
Yeah, I think the basic reality is that I fell into this when I was living in Hong Kong. I used to go drop my daughter off for the school bus at 6:55 in the morning. Or 6:53, it changed, but around 6:55 was the bus time. But none of the cafes around where I lived opened until 9:30.
Oh.
So I had literally 2 hours in the morning with nothing to do, and I'd go back to my apartment, and I don't feel like playing guitar at 7 o'clock in the morning. I know, maybe someone like Tommy Emmanuel just wakes up and pulls a guitar over and starts playing. But I don't feel like making music at that time of the morning. So I just started writing. And there was nothing else to do. Like, I couldn't make an appointment with anyone or, go to the bank, or everything was closed. So I thought, well, I'll just write. And that was a time where I was really trying to unlearn my academic writing voice and acquire a sort of creative nonfiction kind of voice. And it was great for that.
Yeah, tell me more about that. Like, what do you mean by that, your academic voice?
Well, the last time I lived in London, I was an academic. I was working in philosophy of religion, and I was doing a PhD in moral psychology and how ethics is taught in universities. And my academic voice was, this kind of very literary, postmodern, impressive sort of language. I was really externalizing every sort of repressed emotion I had about growing up as an immigrant kid in Australia and feeling othered because if I ever displayed a lack of command of the language. And I was just pouring that into these really sort of terse, complex, difficult to read essays and articles. And then when I quit academia, I thought, well, I'd like to keep writing. And this is when I started my blog. But I found it really hard to just write in a way that sounded like something a human would say. I'd learnt this sort of way of writing that is the sort of social sciences approach to language. And it took me a few years to really get back to the point where I could write a couple of hundred words in a way that was understandable. And it involved a lot of slowing down. I think we don't kind of talk enough about, because you're asking about getting into the mindset for creativity. I think we don't often talk enough about slowing down. I remember when I started doing calligraphy in Japan, I would go along to the calligraphy classes and I would set everything up really quickly, and I'd be ready to go. And everyone else, it was only ever a small class with 2 or 3 other students. They're all just taking their time, like getting the paper out, getting the books out, preparing the ink, doing the whole ink thing. And I thought, hang on, I'm really kind of doing this the dumb way here because I'm not ready. I'm still jittery. I'm still Tokyo traffic is still inside me. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And you can't bring the brush to the paper when you're still in the metro or you're still in the taxi or you're still in whatever else.
Wow, that's fascinating. It reminds me a little bit, when I was living in Tokyo, I used to go back to New Zealand, once a year, maybe once every 2 years, that sort of thing. And I'd go out to see my father, who lives in the middle of nowhere, literally. And, he would always say, you're still on Tokyo mode. Because, for him, life was, the meandering stream down by his house and the honeybees and the Angus cattle out the back, and maybe, we go shoot a goat or something. And it would take, a little while for me to kind of come back down and to do one thing a day was like that was it, whether it's mowing the lawns or rounding up the ducks or whatever, that was the day's work done. And then everything else was just, the beginning and the end of that one thing. And it's just a different pace and it's almost been forgotten. And I sometimes have these memories of my time on the subway, on the Ginza subway line, just crammed in with the people. And I think, now that I've been back in New Zealand for this long and I've kind of released all of that, I don't know if I could push it all back in again.
Yeah. I think there is different places have a different energy to them. Just the same way that rooms have a different kind of silence to them. Silence in each room has a different feeling to it, and places have a different energy. And I think you need to be aware of how that is affecting you. We talked about the way that digital experiences affect us, but I think the way everywhere affects us. I think part of why I do that writing practice that I do is because I think when you wake up in the morning, nothing's really had the chance to affect you yet. So you don't have to decompress from anything.
What was the energy in India like?
Oh, it was fabulously creative and chaotic. I mean, I don't think there's anywhere I've lived where people are more creative and figure out how to solve problems, but it's thoroughly unpredictable. So nothing, you just can't trust that anything is going to go the way you think it will. From where we lived, you could turn the tap on and you might get water, you might get sand. Who knows what's going to happen? The internet was fabulously unreliable. Everything was fabulously unreliable. But it was just, I think it's also really challenging because you have so many different people who have so many different ideas about how to live. Yeah, it's, I wish I had taken more photographs when I was there. I really wasn't into photography at the time because you just like, I have images in my mind of, gleaming new shopping malls and a huge stream of religious devotees on a pilgrimage just walking past the front of this brand new gleaming shopping mall, or somebody, there's a new multiplex cinema and somebody is riding an elephant past the front of it. And I think and I think the art, the way people are really the kind of non-conformity, the way people are really willing to dress in a very vibrant, personal way. I think it's the least conformist place I've lived in terms of how people dress, and particularly in terms of how men dress. The food is fabulous and almost impossible to explain to people who haven't traveled through India. And the fact that you feel like when you live there, you feel like you live on a continent.
Did you retain your creative practice out there?
Well, actually, that was my transition period away from academia back to doing something creative. So I was basically just doing music when I was in India. I was trying to write and just doing music. So I built a little home studio. I started studying via distance with Berklee College of Music. I learned how to use DAW, so I got into using Logic Pro and Reason. And it was kind of, for me, a little bit like a couple of years of sabbatical there, sort of rewiring who I was, learning to be a parent because we had a young kid, learning to be a post-academic person, whatever that was going to be, and learning how to figure out how to come back to music and create on a daily basis.
Wow, that sounds a little bit like your journey, Simon, just kind of coming back to music.
Yeah, it is a little bit like, I've also lived in a couple of countries now so far, and always I've been trying to, I studied sound art at university, and I was like, I thought I was going to have this grand career in like film composing or something like this, and then it just didn't really pan out that way. And I spent the next 10 years of my life sort of doing a bit of country hopping, and every new country that I would go to, I was just trying to refuel my creative juices, and it just never happened until Japan. And I think there was something in the air, there was something in the water, it was meeting Cody, it was just being surrounded by, Japanese people are super creative. Right, there's a lot of people who really have their one creative passion and then they chase it for their whole lives, and being around that is infectious, and my creativity came out. But something I read in your Twitter bio, Fernando, it says made in Chile, grown in Australia, and polished in Japan. And I love that because it really resonated with me, and I think Cody also agrees with that. Like, polished is a great word for Japan. I wonder, did you feel that from India as well? Did you feel that you were polished in some way in India?
I think every place, if you let it in, every place has something really profound to teach you and a way to change you. I think India gave me the chance to introspect really deeply. It was a place where it was okay to ask really profound questions. And I was trying to unpack when I was there a lot of stuff about my beliefs and my religious beliefs and my ethics, as well as what I wanted to do as a career. So I think it gave me freedom to create, freedom to experiment, freedom to introspect. I think Hong Kong, for example, taught me how to do business, taught me how to make money, told me that it was okay to talk about money because as a creative, money's really weird. Money conversations tend to be odd. But Hong Kong sort of made me feel like it's okay to talk about money. It's okay to ask people for money. It's okay to ask people to pay you for your work. You don't have to pretend you're willing to do it for free.
Yeah, it's interesting because I definitely agree with you. Places can teach you things, and people teach you things as well, you know. And there's things I consider myself like kind of like a bit of a magpie, you know, picking things up here and there. And you know, I've learned things from you know, homeless people. I've learned things from you know, people that I've just met on the street, different, you know, friends, you know, all over the world. You know, there's little tidbits, you know, of, you know, practical things, you know, how to do something, or bigger, you know, how to talk about yourself, how to ground yourself, ideas like that, you know, and you just, if you go along, you can kind of just pick these things up and put them in your bag if you want, and you can try it on, and if you don't like it, you can kind of, you know, just, you know, drop it and leave it for someone else. But I think going around with this kind of, you know, magpie attitude, which for people who don't know, it's I guess a bit of a crow, right? Kind of a bird, and just, you know, it picks up things, and then it sometimes it drops them, but it uses it to make a nest. And I think, you know, approaching that, and in this time when, you know, travel is a little bit difficult for a lot of people, but, you know, it can be challenging because maybe you're in the same place, and, you know, you're not getting exposed to new things, but it really is just perspective, I guess. You know, where can you go within what is possible in your situation to, I guess, you know, expose yourself to new ideas.
Yeah, and what's the thing? Figuring out what's the thing in the place that you're in that is great, that you can let inspire you.
Yeah, what's the lesson?
Yeah, because, like, you know, I mean, if you're in India, for example, and you want things to run on time, and you want everything to be clean, and you want everything to be reliable, it's going to be a really, really hard experience. But if you want to go, well, at some point in my life, I have to accept that the world is full of people who don't think the same way I do, it can be a great experience. You know, if you're willing to listen to stories and to listen to where people come from and to the life that they've had, it's pretty amazing. And everywhere I've lived, you could hate it if you wanted to, or you could look for what's amazing about it. You know, Hong Kong, incredible visual city, incredible place to do photography, incredible place to learn about design. You know, and Japan, the sort of the attention to detail, the craft, the seriousness, like you said, the fact that everybody has some kind of creative passion that they chase really, really hard and really seriously and diligently, that attention to quality and the respect for craft is, you know, that's available to you if you want to tune into it.
Yeah. I think, you know, also just coming back to that kind of magpie thing, you know, of picking things up and sort of learning from people, you know, what you mentioned about looking for the good things in places, even when, or the good things from a situation, right? Even if something seems negative or difficult at the time, you know, there's always a lesson, something to be learned from it. And it kind of is part of that polishing process of that kind of character development. And, you know, you can almost put these ideas on and try them on for size, you know. And so, you know, when I was last year, you know, stuck in my hometown, actually, a place I hadn't been for, you know, 5 years, or, you know, and it had changed so much. And I pretty much got locked down there and stuck with my grandparents, actually. And I was like, you know, from the outside, I was like, oh man, what's going on here? But it ended up being this profound experience to spend, you know, 8 months living with them and like finding out all of this stuff that I hadn't really connected with since I was a kid. And, you know, trying that on and just living in a homely place, you know, not being this high-flying Tokyo guy anymore, but, you know, just being back home. And so looking for that, and whatever it might be, even as a small thing, there's always these kind of, these nuggets of passion and positivity that you can find. And it seems like everything out there is trying to push the negative on you, you know, and something I always come back to is this kind of flame of your passion. And I think of it as a flame because once it goes out, it can be hard to kind of get it back on, you know, and get it lit again. But if you can feed it little bits of these kind of little bits of fuel, little bits of positivity and passion, you know.
I think the sense of fueling your creativity is really important. And sometimes negative experiences can fuel that. Sometimes like bad things can fuel that. This year I've been doing a bunch of memoir writing, and I'm not entirely sure what's going to come of that yet, but some of that is reflecting on really bad experiences that I've had in my life. But you need to think, with this thing I have, what can I do out of this that's creative? I think the toxicity is like, I mentioned doom scrolling before. That's the toxicity of social media, where you just spin your wheels in the mud and you're not doing anything with it. And I think I've always gravitated towards, what can you do in a situation? What is a situation teaching you? Because that's your fuel.
Yeah.
If your environment is feeding you this, it's going to keep feeding it to you.
Yeah. And even, good and bad experiences, I mean, I think that there's something to be said in there as well, because I think it's this kind of simplification of language and experience, where it's like, something's good or it's bad. But I think thinking of something as transformative potentially is a way of looking at it, right? And, we've all had things in our life that have been difficult, but being able to take them and use that energy and being able to transform that into something and use that to fire your practice. Because at the end of the day, if you've got that energy there and it's bumping around, you've got to kind of find a way to work with it and kind of ride that horse of creativity and sort of whether you're galloping or just sort of sitting there. It's kind of their relationship with that, and it's quite a, I don't know, we don't really have the language to describe this. I think you know what I mean though, but like.
Yeah, we don't, because we tend to either or it into like positive or negative. I think transformative is a really good one. I think also, I think there's some language that we should use a bit more often around liberating. We go to inspiring really quickly, but I think sometimes you can have a really negative experience that begets a really liberating piece of art.
Yeah.
I think we have that in, music is an incredible form for doing exactly that. Turning terrible experiences into, turning a terrible experience into a liberating piece of art. That you listen to this piece of music and it's come from something bad that happened, but it makes you feel a lot of emotions that we label them as positive, but it's a complex of emotions that you feel in response to the music.
Yeah. That's beautiful. It's like the flavors, sort of bringing all of these different ingredients together, and the relationship, because as you say, it's not an either or. They are all. It's all connected, and
something can be angry and beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Cool. Well, that was great. I actually feel really.
Thank you.
Really empowered.
Fascinating, yeah.
Yeah.
It really was, Fernando. Thank you.
I don't know. I'm just sort of sitting here, and to be honest, I'm a bit sort of stunned with some of the stuff that we've just talked about. It's really why I guess we wanted to, bring you on and talk to you about this stuff, and seeing your writing, because I think it's so important right now, and a lot of the world's hurting, I can feel it around me, in New Zealand. We've got this kind of pseudo lockdown. Where is it going to continue? Is it not? There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of free floating anxiety, I think is what they're calling it. And it sort of gets directed in different ways. And it's kind of pantomime of people going about their daily life and continuing the routine. But there's also this kind of fear and anxiety that is permeating. And I guess the goal of these conversations is to provide a little bit of a light and say an opportunity to say, look, there is a way to work through this and to harness this and to look forward to what is coming up next and have hope and all of those, I guess, positive takes of, developing a practice, as opposed to what would be nihilism, effectively, if you were to follow what all of the negativity that, yeah.
So, I mean, sarcasm and cynicism and snark, those are the modalities that often feel like the response to this. And you're right. I think we do have something of an obligation. I'm cautious about putting shoulds on other creative people.
Yeah.
But I think we do have something of an obligation to to audit what we put into the world in this moment. Because you're right, a lot of people are hurting. There's tremendous uncertainty. I think in a lot of ways, 2021 has been harder than 2020.
I agree, yeah.
Because I feel like 2020, we all just went into disaster mode. And it's like, well, let's batten down and cope with this. But now it's like, well, are we out of it yet? Where are we?
Yeah, 2020. It was kind of like, we just get through it, and then it'll be over by Christmas, right? That's sort of the thing. But now it's like, no, it's coming back, and it's this long game, and I think that's where it's in that long game where people can enter the state of despair potentially, and it's a dangerous place to be, and it's something that, if anyone's having that difficulty, it's like, reach out, talk to someone, and work through it, because there is hope in it, and from all of this, I believe that there will be something beautiful will emerge. And just on that note, just speaking of Hong Kong a little bit, I don't know if this was the time when you were living there, but recently a friend sent me an album. It's a band called My Little Airport, and it's just extremely beautiful. Just I want to say almost innocent. Just it's probably from about 2007. And just the music, very simple, very poppy, and just it reminds me of the good old days. And it almost feels like we've forgotten what that looks like, what that sounds like, what that feels like. And with everything happening in the world today, listening to something, I listened to the album actually, the whole thing, and I just thought, this takes me back. It reminds me that there was a time when things were a little bit better, and there will be a time soon as well when things will be better than they are now. And we will be able to all use this energy and this kind of situation to inform our practice and create great things, hopefully.
Yeah, I think so as well.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you very much for chatting with us. It was really informative. I really appreciate it. And I hope we can maybe do another catch-up at some point. But otherwise, all the best with your practice and everything you're working on. And it's great that you tour in London. Maybe you can catch up when you've got time.
I hope so.
Yeah,
that would be good.
Alrighty.
Talk to you later.
Take care.